Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 10, which is all about development. I apologize in advance if you can hear some car noise going on. It is very, very hot. We are having a little bit of a heat wave while I record, and I do not have air conditioning in my house, so closing my windows right now would be pretty uncomfortable. So I'm going to leave them open and just try to ignore the occasional car driving by. Just imagine, rather than taking an online class, we were having a lecture like outside, which seems much nicer. Okay, so chapter 10, all about development. We're going to talk about what do we mean by a more developed country versus a less developed country. And we've talked about more developed and less developed. I've used those terms MDC and LDC throughout the course. Your textbook uses them. But we're going to talk a lot about like why do some places look like Auckland, New Zealand here at the top, and why do some places look like this neighborhood in Cape Town, South Africa. So what is development in the first place? What do I mean by development? There's three big things that go into development. The first one is economics. How much are you producing? How much are you consuming? How much income do you have? How much wealth do you have? The next thing is infrastructure, right? Do you have roads and sewers and buildings, etc., right? We talk about kind of, you know, do we have a train system? Do we have a highway system? Lots of places around the world do not have these things. They do not have clean drinking water that comes out of the faucet when you turn it on. So that type of development. And then there are all these human indicators, and we're going to talk a lot about the excuse me, Human Development Index, which is kind of ranking things like health. How long do people live? What are the rates of disease? Education, how long do people go to school? What are literacy rates look like? And also basic human needs. Do you have enough to eat? Do you have shelter? And there are correlations between all three of these. So generally speaking, if you have a good economic system, you have large amounts of infrastructure, you're also going to have higher levels of these other human indicators. And so we're going to talk about why does development vary among countries? Why are some rich and why are some poor? And there's a lot of kind of myths surrounding why some places are rich and why some places are poor. We often refer to things kind of in a very dichotomous manner. So there's developed and developing, first world and third world, more developed and less developed. I use it in this course. Your textbook uses it. I want you to be critical of these dichotomies. One, because it's a ranking system and we don't want to say that one country is better than another. And the other, it implies a single trajectory, which I'll talk about later, that there's a path that you go on to becoming more developed and everybody has to follow this same path. The UN uses something called the Human Development Index, which scores things like income, health, and education on a score from 0 to 1, 1 being perfect. Nobody has a 1. Some people come pretty close, some of the Nordic countries and Japan. You can see on this map here, lots of, United States, Canada, lots of Europe, Australia, very highly developed versus poorer countries like those in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Middle East and Asia have rank lower on the Human Development Index. But I want to make a point that I'm not sure your textbook drives home enough, is that the major reason that started this path of who is more developed and isn't, and it is very complicated, but is colonialism, right? So basically, when Europeans went out and colonized, they began this process of who was more developed and who was less developed. There were plenty of complex civilizations in other places before Europeans went around, and there is a bunch of reasons why they were able to conquer, including things like they had guns and disease and complex navies and a bunch of other things. And I'm not going to totally get into that, but what I want you to understand is that this system by which we are in now, where we have some countries that are much, much wealthier than other countries, is a vestige of colonialism. and something called neocolonialism, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But first, let's look at income. There's a couple of different ways that we talk about income. The first is the gross national income, or the GNI. This is the per capita income per person, right? So if you take all of the money in that country, divide it up evenly above every person in that country, men, women, children, people who are working, people who aren't working. This doesn't mean that everybody has this money, but if you divided it up evenly, um, countries in Europe, in United States, Canada, Australia, some of the Middle Eastern countries, especially those that are oil wealthy, they have a very high gross national income, $20,000 or above, as opposed to other countries which have a lower gross national income. And then there is PPP, which adjusts for the cost of living. So basically, when you look at it adjusted for how much it costs to live there, the picture changes a little bit. So if you look at the bottom, the US does not quite fare as much as all of Europe. Canada fares a little bit better than the United States. And you can see a big divide between Southern and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, which if you took my regional class, we would talk a lot more about why those kind of divides exist. And then you have some countries where you really don't have data on cost of living, very good data, for a variety of reasons. Either the countries aren't collecting it, or the countries aren't releasing it as well. But generally speaking, more income equality is better for everybody. So we have a lot of income inequality within our country, which I'll talk about later, and there's a lot of global wealth inequality. Generally speaking, the less inequality we have, the more evenly things are distributed. It is better. The stronger the middle class, the better and stronger economies tend to be. This is one of the reasons why politicians always talk about growing the middle class and having a strong middle class. This is one of the indicators of a healthy economy and a growing human development index. This is one of the things that China has been able to do. They have really been able to bring a lot of people out of poverty and grow their middle class. So has India, and so they have moved ahead a lot of those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, we're going to talk about a lot of reasons why that is. And you have different economic sectors that kind of correlate with income and how much income you have. So you have primary economic sectors. These are where you're getting your raw materials, your mining, your fishing, your agriculture. These are biggest in less developed countries. Less developed countries tend to just export raw materials to the global market rather than make things. Then you have secondary economic sectors, which are manufacturing, assembling, refining. So depending on the type of manufacturing, generally speaking, high-tech manufacturing happening in places like China, which are considered emerging economies, so between a less developed and a more developed. Then you have kind of more low-tech manufacturing, like clothing, happening in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. So those countries kind of also following that path. And then, so these are biggest in these medium developing countries. A lot of our stuff is not made in the United States, which some people are pretty upset about, but there's a reason why it's made over there. There's cheaper labor and a variety of other reasons, but generally speaking, these are your medium developing countries. And then you have tertiary economic sectors. These are sectors that have moved into service economies. The United States is one of them. And Europe, places like Hong Kong, right? You have a lot of financial institutions, a lot of tech, but it's primarily a service industry. They're not necessarily making something, but their income is based on a service economy. And those are biggest in more developed countries, United States, Europe. Not to say that no manufacturing happens there, not to say that no farming happens there. We certainly do lots of farming in the United States. It just means it's not the big basis of our economy. Now, the reason why you tend to have these less developed countries doing this primary economic jobs is that wealth, it's usually those people who are growing bananas and picking bananas and packaging the bananas that are not making very much money. But these natural resources that are gained through mining and fishing and agriculture and some other things are primarily exported to other countries. And that's what colonialism was really about. Not completely, but a lot. It was about extracting wealth from what are now less developed countries and transferring it to more developed countries. So I want us to remember that too. This economic system was set up whereby which you take these natural resources of one country and kind of push it over to another country. And those relationships still remain today. Next, we're going to talk about health. So the Human Development Index uses life expectancy as an indicator of health. There are other ways to measure life expectancy. You can look at infant mortality rates, morbidity, which is kind of death and rates of sickness. If you look at the life expectancy map here, you can again see that countries that generally fare better economically also have longer life expectancies. But all of these variables don't hold true across. We as a country lag behind other wealthy nations in infant mortality. Behind a lot of nations in infant mortality. This is just really looking at European countries, but we lag behind places like Cuba as well, where we have a pretty high infant mortality rate. Infant mortality is infant deaths per 1,000 live births. For an industrialized country, we have a very high infant mortality rate. Education, Human Development Index uses years of schooling and expected years of schooling, right? So generally speaking, in the United States, in Europe, you get 10 or more years of schooling. Other measures include the pupil to teacher ratio, right? So are you is one person teaching 100 students, or are they teaching 20 students? The literacy rate is a big one, right? So Europe, North America, large parts of Latin America, really high literacy rates as opposed to in poorer countries, mainly because it's harder to stay in school for longer, which I'll talk about why that is. And then the cost of education. College is free in some more developed countries for their citizens. There are a lot of people in the United States who are trying to push for us to have free college education here. You are getting a pretty discounted education at a community college, which is a good way to go in the United States. I went to a community college before I transferred to a four-year university before I did my graduate work. The class that I teach you is the exact same class that I teach at a Cal State, which I also teach at. And then you also look at, is elementary school unaffordable in some less developed countries? Even though some places you have to pay to go to elementary school, as if you were going to a private school, but also some places you may not have to pay. The actual education may be free, but you may not be able to afford the uniform or the books or the transportation to get to school, or you may not be able to afford to let your children not be working on the farm with you. You may need them there. But all three, again, of these correlate together. Wealthy countries can take care of sick people sometimes. Sometimes we do better jobs than others. It is, very possible in the United States to go bankrupt because of an illness. Wealthy countries can provide better education. Generally speaking, we have compulsory education that is required and is free. It is not equal, though. Our public school system in this country, there are some public schools that are ranked much, much higher than other public schools. Healthy people are more able to go to school, and healthy people are more productive at work. So having this idea that, if you're sick all the time, if you cannot go to the doctor when you are sick and you have these prolonged illnesses, you're going to miss a lot of time at work and be less economically productive. And also, better educated people tend to make better health choices for themselves. because they have more knowledge about kind of health systems, and better educated people make more money. So most of the time, not necessarily all of the time, uh, but generally speaking, these are generalized trends. There are plenty of people who get a lot of education and then are unable to find a job. There are plenty of people who make a lot of money who have less education. But when we're looking kind of at global scale, right, countries that have more education, have more people who spend longer in school, generally are making more money. You can also have variations within countries. Here's a map of Brazil and China and Mexico. I'm going to focus on China for a minute. China has really kind of raised a lot of people out of poverty. And it's done it in some pretty unique ways, but a lot of China is still very rural. A lot of people migrate in China to work in cities, and those cities that are on the coastlines, those are the places that are exporting goods. So generally speaking, the people who are living in those cities and working in these manufacturing sectors, they are going to have higher income than those who are living in rural areas. Same things in places like Mexico and in Brazil. Generally speaking, if you're going to live in a city, you're going to make more money. And the same thing is also true in the United States. Not always. We always want to account for a cost of living as well. But what do you think a map of the USA would look like? It would look like probably what you would expect, where you have some of the poorer states have lower human development index, lots of states in the south, or lots of states that are more rural, as opposed to a lot of wealthy states in the northeast. California is the world's sixth largest economy all by itself. But there is certainly variations in human development across the U.S. This is also a different metric. The Human Development Index measures from 0 to 1, which I want you to remember. This map is using a different metric, so it's ranking it between 3 something and 6 something. But the Human Development Index from the UN just measures 0 to 1. I want to talk a little bit about gender inequality in development. Women are less developed than men everywhere. That is a terrible sentence. It makes us sound like we are just less developed. Somehow we are not as intelligent. That is not true. What I mean by women are less developed everywhere is that generally speaking, everywhere globally, women make less money for the same job. We have less access to sometimes to education. We also tend to have lower literacy rates. We live longer, but less education overall and less income. So if we look at female to male literacy rates around the world, in India, 65% of women can read versus 82% of men. In Yemen, which is much poorer, you have a much higher rate of inequality there among literacy rates, 47% to 81%. In Sierra Leone, overall very low literacy, but again, that stark difference between men and women. Generally speaking, the more developed countries get, the more equality you get among the sexes. The more that wage gap tends to close, the more that literacy and education gap tends to close. This situation is improving slowly, and a lot of what happens around the world is a lot of girls are pulled out of school much earlier than boys. If you can only educate one of your children, if you can only pay to educate one of your children, odds are it's going to be a boy and not a girl. Girls are pulled out earlier for a variety of reasons, including marriage. But in addition, when women start menstruating, very often they cannot afford the supplies that they need in order to leave home during that 1 week a month. And so very often that's when girls will stop going to school in poorer countries. And then at that point, that is when, women might also be married because, well, they can't go to school and they are, possibly now considered a liability on the household, an economic liability on the household. So it is time to get married. And then we can also, with concerns to gender equality, look at things, again, education versus labor force participation. Many educated women are not in the workforce, especially in the United States and in Europe. There are many women who get plenty of education and do not work. That was less common, excuse me, that was more common in our history, where you would have women who would go to college, um, especially wealthier women who never had any intention of working or were not expected to work. That was kind of a joke that you went to college to find your husband in order to get your MRS degree, your Mrs. degree. And but generally speaking, now in places with higher rates of development, you have more women in the workforce. You also have women doing paid versus unpaid labor. And what I mean by that is there's all types of labor that women do, informal labor, household labor, taking care of the children, that have an economic cost that is kind of internalized. And so if I am married and I have 2 children, and I decide when those children are small to stay home with those children as opposed to going to the workforce, I am taking care of childcare, whereas opposed to if I'm going to work, there's somebody else has to be paid for that childcare during the day. And so very often women's unpaid labor, such as cooking and taking care of the household and taking care of the children, is not really factored into some economic models, but it really does have a pretty profound effect on the economy. And then also what happens with women is that when we step out in order to take care of our children, it's often very hard to step back into the workforce. You also have female-dominated farm labor in less developed countries. So, if you have a country that is less developed, maybe you have men who are leaving the farm to go work in a city, but then you're going to have females who are going to be working on that farm. Lots of countries have mandated maternity leave. Um, and so basically you get a certain amount of paid maternity leave, based upon the law. And so, technically Rwanda is very agricultural. They technically have legally mandated maternity leave, but obviously this woman with this baby on her back, she's still working, right? Because she is working, she is doing this unpaid labor on her own farm. The other thing that I want to note is that the United States is the only industrialized country that does not have paid maternity leave. We give 6 weeks of unpaid maternity leave, which a lot of women can't afford to take 6 weeks off of work. California allows you to take your sick time, but around the world, in Canada, you get 50 weeks of maternity leave. France, you get 16 of paid maternity. This is paid maternity leave. This is not even talking about unpaid maternity leave. Unpaid maternity leave means you're not going to get paid, but they'll hold your job. In the United States, we only get 6 weeks of that. And we get no mandated paid maternity leave. Some companies might have their own policies, but it's usually the people who are making the least that have the least amount of maternity leave. So in countries like France, you get 16 weeks of paid maternity leave. But I believe up to 2 years of unpaid maternity leave, and they also have subsidized or free childcare. So in the United States, you do not get paid maternity leave, and in addition, childcare for us is very expensive. So when my daughter was born, almost 5 years ago now, to put her in childcare full time, which I couldn't even do until she was 6 months old, but putting her in where she went, but putting her in childcare full time would have cost me $1,600 a month. So a lot of women in the United States choose to leave the workforce to stay home with their kids as an economic decision. And then that's where you get a lot of gender inequality and a pay gap, because even when women step back in years later, it's hard to kind of catch up on your career. And generally speaking, people take us less seriously. They're worried that we're going to have to go home when our kids are sick. And men do not take that hit economically. I also want to talk about energy resources, right? Generally speaking, places that are more developed use more energy. They have higher rates of consumption. If you have no energy, you have no development. right? Um, you must have it or import it in order to be developed, right? The Industrial Revolution was all about fossil fuels and kind of harnessing the power of fossil fuels. It was about other things as well, but definitely about harnessing the power of fossil fuels. We have a demand for energy in more developed countries and a supply in less developed countries. This is not true everywhere, um, but generally speaking, you're going to use less energy in a less developed country. You are going to go back to the global footprint network. And you're going to look at kind of footprint again when we talk about energy consumption versus more developed and less developed countries. We talk a lot in this country about energy independence, right? We don't want to be dependent on other countries for our energy supply. Large uses of energy lead to environmental and health problems from fossil fuel consumption, air pollution, climate change, and a variety of other issues. We have better regulations in more developed countries. We used to have really horrifyingly bad air pollution in the United States. We got the Clean Air Act and the EPA, and our air got much better, right? So pollution can be a symptom of growth. Here is Shanghai on a bad day, but a pretty average day for air pollution. Lots of coal-fired power plants. China has had 1.2 million premature deaths per year based upon pollution, 12 million healthy life years lost, but much less poverty. This is part using all of this energy and coal and all these natural resources that they have has allowed them to industrialize and raise a lot of people out of poverty. But there is a trade-off. Again, we had very bad air pollution. This is Pittsburgh in the 1940s. The Clean Air Act and the EPA worked. We had rivers that were so polluted that they would literally catch fire. I want to also talk about the resource curse, because a lot of when people talk about why countries are more developed and less developed, people say, well, they don't have any natural resources. And that is often not true at all. So countries with energy resources often stay poor, even though they have those energy resources. That's because the money from those resources goes to more developed countries. So oil from Nigeria or oil from Ecuador in the Amazon is often the companies who are extracting that oil are multinationals, and they are selling that oil to more developed countries. They are not selling them to the less developed countries. They can't afford it as much, but they have less environmental regulations. So it's the people who are living there who are often dealing with the effects of that resource extraction. It exploits cheap labor, right? It's much cheaper to employ people in Nigeria than it is in the United States. It harms the environment. Those costs are externalized. So we benefit from that cheap labor and those environmental regulations through our cheap gas prices here. And we have relatively cheap gas prices here. They're certainly a lot less expensive than they are in Europe. But, other people are paying that cost. Of neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is still that extracting wealth from less developed countries and transferring it to more developed countries. But we don't have actual, for the most part, colonialism, right? It's not that England is occupying India and taking the wealth directly from India, but because these relationships were formed under colonialism, you are still having that movement of wealth from less developed to more developed as a kind of vestige of colonialism, which is referred to as neocolonialism. Lots of countries, more developed countries, are kind of shifting energy sources away from fossil fuels. Things like nuclear. This is the San Onofre power plant, which is closed recently. But solar, wind, hydroelectric, renewable Um, uh, with limitations, sometimes it's hard to get all of the energy that we need from renewables given the constraints that we have. But there are lots of ways to do that. Nuclear power is very popular in Europe. Um, you have no carbon emissions, but there are some other problems with them. Generally speaking, we were supposed to have a permanent storage facility in the United States for spent fuel rods, which we do not have. So they are just kind of hanging out on site. And there's questions about, if you have a meltdown, you can have radiation. We've had power plants globally who've had meltdowns before, and it is not good. When the tsunami and earthquake hit Japan several years ago, the Fukushima power plant was flooded, and there were some radiation leaks that happened there. And people said, why would Japan build a power plant like that next to the ocean on a fault line? And then we could just point to San Onofre. We did the same thing. So right now, the United States has decided to leave things on site, although that is not a good permanent solution because the on site holding generally was not meant to last a very long time. San Onofre, as I believe, is being moved off site at some point in the next 5 years due to the fact it being near the ocean, being a tsunami risk, and being an earthquake zone. We also sometimes use biofuels, things like ethanol that we make from corn. Those can help us become more energy efficient, but generally they also release a lot of CO2 um, as well. And so it's hard to get these sources of energy off the ground when we have a lot of cheap fossil fuels. Subsidies can help us make the shift, right? And what I mean by subsidies is the government says we are going to give some money to kind of start up these companies. We are going to give consumers an incentive to buy solar panels, or we're going to give companies an incentive to manufacture them, and that drives down the cost. Solar panels 20 years ago were extraordinarily expensive. Now you drive around Southern California, and you see them on a lot of people's homes because the price went down considerably. And you can have solar farms in a place like Germany, and I say in Germany ? Germany has a lot of cloud cover. You can do some pretty efficient solar capture. And the future is kind of uncertain, right? Some places have really invested in renewables. China is really investing in renewables. The current administration in the United States is really shifting away from that investment. And a lot of states, a lot of people make a lot of money from things like wind farms. Texas is the biggest producer of wind energy in the country. You have a lot of flat, open land. You have a lot of people who have this land who might do some type of ranching on it, but they can also throw up a wind farm on it, make some money, and it doesn't hurt their other livelihood. So what are some obstacles to development? What are some things that keeps places from becoming more developed? Geography explains some of it, right? Does a country have the resources or the ability to import them? What does the landscape look like? Does it have a shoreline? Can it have ports like we see here in Malaysia? Does it have rivers? Is it rugged? Is there a lot of rugged terrain? Sub-Saharan Africa, which I talk a lot about in my regional class, lacks navigable rivers. They have rivers, but they don't have many high mountains. And so they have these kind of very shallow rivers that have a lot of waterfalls in them, and you can't take a boat up them, as opposed to in South America where you can. Proximity to markets, right? Even if you're going to make goods, are you able to export them out? Policy kind of explains more at this point, and so do governments create conditions for industrialization? And we're going to talk about kind of two distinct yet overlapping paths to industrialization. But if you have a government that's very closed off and very autocratic, they might not be promoting industrialization, and so or outside investment, and that can be difficult. The most developed countries, or the more developed countries on the planet, were the first to industrialize during the Industrial Revolution, which saw a lot of people moving to cities, living together, and that has an effect on innovation and productivity, and that coupled with fossil fuels, but it also drove incomes higher. So we have where it started in England in the 1700s. Um, and then moved throughout Europe and to the USA next. That was the first wave of industrialization. There have been multiple waves of industrialization, particularly throughout Asia. So some parts of Europe later to industrialize, the south of Europe, the east of Europe, as opposed to places like England and Germany. So you see those places that were first to industrialize really being kind of economic powerhouses. And this, again, is still diffusing today. There are still countries that are going through this process. So what do you need to industrialize? What do you need for an industrial revolution? You need resources, right? These can be taken from other countries in some circumstances, but you have to have a certain amount at home. But you can certainly import some things that you need. You need to have education. You, generally speaking, need to have a more educated public in order to participate in this industrialization. You need to have willing elites. And what I mean by willing elites is there's a lot of countries around the world which have not really industrialized. If you think about a place like North Korea, which is really autocratic, has kind of one leader, but there is an upper echelon there that is not willing to let the rest of the country really industrialize like that, because if you spread the wealth around, it threatens your power, right? As opposed to having a consolidation of wealth just among the elites. And then you need to have money to invest, right? You have to have a certain amount of wealth in the first place. So colonialism got a lot of these countries a lot of wealth in the beginning, and so they had that wealth and they had that money to invest. There are two primary paths that have been used to get this. They overlap. They are not necessarily distinct, I don't want you to take them as kind of like equal objects going on this single trajectory towards industrialization. This is ways that it has been done in the past. Path one is self-sufficiency, where you discourage imports. You practice trade protectionism. So basically you don't allow a lot of imports, or you tax them or put tariffs on them when they come in. You subsidize, like I talked before about the wind and solar, but you subsidize your local industry and you nationalize a lot of industries. So steel, electricity, right? You take local control over them. This creates jobs at home. It does. If communists were kind of not very good at industrializing in the USSR. They kind of did some misindustrialization here, but basically they took over everything. And so everybody had a job. There was always something to do. But India in the 20th century did this as well. And they saw modest growth. So their economy grew, but not extraordinarily quickly. There was a lot of inefficiency and bureaucracy and corruption, and a lot of this also is a holdover from colonialism. A lot of the political systems that were set up during colonialism kind of stay. And this approach to economics and industrialization is out of favor now, kind of. And I say kind of because if I was teaching this class 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I would say it's really out of favor now. But it is not necessarily out of favor now, because there are a lot of elections happening, a lot of people on the ballot or people who are being elected who are pushing more towards this idea of self-sufficiency, and bringing manufacturing back home was a huge part of Trump's platform. And right now people are worried about, he's put a bunch of tariffs and taxes on a bunch of imports, including things like steel. A lot of economists say that this is not going to work. This is going to lead to trade war and generally be bad for the economy in general. We've lost a lot of manufacturing in the United States, not just due to labor shifts, but also due to mechanization. So there's a lot of stuff that we used to make that now machines make, so you just generally need less people. The second path is international trade, where you get foreign investment and you make things and you export them. There's a couple of types here. One is kind of cheap factory labor. So examples, and this is kind of in order of how they industrialized. South Korea, which has now entered more a service economy. Mexico, which is a more developed, would not necessarily be considered an MDC, but it is certainly more developed. It's like that middle developing country, as well as China, and now places like Bangladesh, which are less developed countries. These countries, you have cheap factory labor to make stuff. You also usually have a lot of very poor working conditions for people. So this is a garment factory collapse in Bangladesh, and this is garment factory collapsing and fires and horrible working conditions has gotten a lot of publicity, and it goes in waves over years. But generally speaking, the supply chains are so muddled that places like the Gap don't do a very good job of monitoring them. So you have people who are working, often children, and that is why you can go to H&M and get a shirt for $5. Um, and You also have places like China now who are part of this cheap factory labor now investing in other places, in particular in Africa. Type 2 is resource exploitation. An example of this is oil in the Middle East or coffee in Kenya, right? So where you have, for a lot of countries, they have taken that oil money, especially in the Middle East, a lot of the monarchies there, they've taken that oil money and they've really invested it back into their country. There are extractive regimes who do not do that, who take that oil money, like Saddam Hussein, and just used it for himself. But there are a lot of countries that take that oil money, or coffee in Kenya, for example, and put that money back into their country. There are some problems with this type of industrialization. One, you're dependent on more developed countries to sell your goods and resources to. You also wind up with something called banana republic economies. Banana Republic refers to the Dominican Republic. It is not just a store that is also owned by the Gap. Um, Basically, where you have an economy that is built upon one thing, right? So in the Dominican Republic, it used to be bananas. If you have an economy that is built on a single thing, if that price drops, that is going to have ripples throughout your entire economy. It's part of what's happened in Venezuela. Venezuela has oil. Venezuela, their economy is entirely based upon oil. They import almost all of their food. They don't have anything else that they have grown. And now that the price of oil dropped, they had food shortages and a bunch of other things. But it also leads to this kind of race to the bottom, right? Who can provide the cheapest wages? Which usually means also the worst conditions for those workers. And when we go back to that self-sufficiency versus international trade, this is India. India did see an overall increase if you look at that red line during self-sufficiency, but there's a ton of instability that's happening there. As opposed through international trade, you can see this is the global economic collapse that happened in 2008, which affected everybody. But you can see that India has fared better through an international trade model. So again, these things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Um, we also have problems with widening inequality, which I mentioned that generally speaking, the more inequality you have, the worse it is for economies, the less stable economies are. But generally speaking, right now, globally and in the United States, rich people are getting richer, um, including people and countries. So wealthy countries are getting wealthier overall. Um, Globalization is making that easier through these multinational corporations and this globalization of business. In more developed countries, inequality is a big problem. So in the US, the top 10% has 30% of the income, and the bottom 10% has 2% of the income, right? So huge difference. It's actually I'm going to have you watch a clip about inequality in the United States, which actually is quite staggering how much the wealth is kind of distributed in the United States. In less developed countries, it's an even bigger problem. In places like Brazil, you have huge inequality. Um, the but globally speaking, the top 1% owns nearly half of the world's wealth. 1% of the people on the planet owns half of the world's wealth. 10% of the people on the planet own 87% of the world's wealth. You can imagine what a bargaining chip that is, right? If you are in that other 90% of people, how much power do you wield on a global market? The world's 85 richest people own as much of the wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest. There is an incredible amount of inequality and a huge gap between the rich and the poor globally and in the United States. And that's how you wind up with scenes like this in Mumbai, where you have, some pretty abject, horrific poverty, but then also multi-million dollar um, homes as well being built in the same city not that far away. This model, though, kind of assumes that there is one path to wealth, and the assumption is that every country eventually industrializes. But, then if that happens, who grows the food and who sews the shirts and who controls production? And can we all consume more resources, which you're going to learn that we can't, right? We are already now using resources faster than the earth can replenish them. And so everybody is not going to be able to have this level of consumption, or we're going to have to get a lot smarter about our consumption. So these paths are going to have to change. And then there's different ways of looking at it, right? So, starting up small businesses through microfinance loans in places like Bangladesh, as opposed to having kind of massive external investment. But that huge wealth gap will remain unless there's some pretty significant changes, right? Our realistic goal is not to have everybody industrialize and become like the US and Europe. The realistic goal is to just have people be able to lead better lives and have enough. And, that's going to come in some part for it to work. Some people are going to need to have higher rates of consumption, but those who have the highest rates of consumption, predominantly us in Europe, are going to have lower rates of consumption. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is just free trade versus fair trade export models. So I talked about that kind of idea of international trade. Free trade, which a lot of people are a big fan on, there's fewer restrictions on exports and imports. There's more international competition, and there's a lower price for consumers, but this also means a very low wage for workers. So again, that person picking the coffee, growing the coffee, picking the avocados, they are making almost nothing. Fair trade is a deliberate effort to give a living wage to workers. So at our end, we pay slightly higher prices if it says fair trade on it, and I encourage you to shop fair trade if you're able to, and some fair trade certifications are worth more than others, but it also gives you fewer middlemen. There's less of a place to mark up on your way throughout the system. So that coffee goes more directly from the grower to your kitchen. And so there's less people kind of taking a chunk and marking it up along the way. That is the end of our lecture on development.